an introduction to economics. A few disclaimers. Firstly, I'm not an economics student. I study finance. It's like economics of economics with a small fake. So some of this might be wrong, but I think most of it's right. The other quality this presentation has is it's super high level. So what I'm going to try and do is firstly go over a bunch of basic concepts, which are just like major theories in economics and what those theories argue for. I'm going to try and throughout give you some useful illustrations of how those theories apply so you can understand how they work. And then after that, hopefully it'll give you a sense of how to construct economic arguments from first principles. So the goal here is not to try and give you like a bunch of mechanisms that you can use in debates or some default arguments that you can apply to different motions. What I'm trying to do is give you a really, really high level background understanding of economic principles so that when you're presented with an economics debate, you can use that information to construct your own arguments about how things work in the context where you have to apply them. If you do want a seminar that will give you a more applied approach to economics, the reason why I'm not giving one of those seminars is because when I was preparing this seminar, I spent like 2 hours watching other economic seminars on YouTube, and there are a ton of other resources out there specific to debating on economics, and I think those are pretty good, and I probably couldn't produce anything better than that. Look on the Australian Debating Facebook page, there's a big public resources folder, and that public resources folder, I might put it in the UADC debating chat after this, has a massive list of really good economic seminars. So what I'm going to try and do here is bridge the gap between those kinds of seminars and then the kinds of generic economics videos you'll find on YouTube talking about economic theories. So give you a bit of both. Okay. The goal is, like I said, I want you to try and figure out economic arguments on your own. I'm going to try and give you the tools to do that. Okay, so we're going to start way back with classical economics. The key claim of classical economics is just that markets are self-regulating. So the context here is, it's sort of like the 1800s. Prior to this, most economies were extremely centrally managed. Most economies in Europe were run by monarchs. They were very protectionist. They had lots of inefficiencies. There was massive wealth inequality and very little freedom. So we kind of look back on classical economics and we think of it as being cool, but for its context, classical economics is all about economic freedom and individual freedom. It argues that the government should have little to no intervention in the economy because needs are best served when people are able to fulfill each other's needs by meeting market forces. So essentially, if a need arises, it will be filled by another market participant, and everything works best when people are allowed to act in their own self-interest, because their own self-interest will be aligned by the market with fulfilling other people's needs. So take the example of a baker who makes bread. The baker makes bread because it makes them money, and that economic interest is also filling the need of people who want to make bread. It's from here that we first get the concept of supply and demand, which if you guys have done like high school economics or you're currently doing an economics course, will be like really obvious to you. But I still think it's a useful thing to remember in the context of debates. It applies to basically any good that is demanded and supplied. So you can think of goods and services in terms of how much people want to buy them and how much people want to produce them. You can also think of wages or currencies or the share of a company as being affected by how much supply of that thing exists and how much people want of that thing. So if you take the bread example again, the argument here is the price is a product of how much people want bread and how much people are willing to produce bread. And it comes back to this idea that the market works best when people fulfill their own individual interests. So take a baker who's making bread for $20 a loaf, that's a massive ripoff. Another baker, to fulfill their own self-interest, will move in next door, start selling it for less, and that will produce an equilibrium price where the supply meets the demand at this point. The other concept that we get out of classical economics is the idea of having comparative advantage. And that is, again, rooted in the principle that governments should minimally interfere in economies to create the most efficiency. Comparative advantage is all about opportunity cost. So an opportunity cost is essentially what you could have done instead. or the cost of missing out on another opportunity because you did one thing. An example I've illustrated here is, if the opportunity cost of growing wheat is very low, that must mean you're good at producing or good at growing wheat and bad at doing other stuff, like manufacturing cars, because your trade-off for choosing to focus on growing wheat or focusing on agriculture is very low. That suggests that a country which has a low opportunity cost for agriculture should focus on that, and it should purchase its manufactured products or purchase other goods from other countries which are better at that. So again, it all links back to the principle of minimal government intervention, allowing people to act in their own self-interest to produce maximum efficiency. Yeah, the principle, the French word for it just means let it be. Government intervention stops people from fulfilling each other's needs efficiently. So you can think about each of these different kinds of government intervention and the ways how that might manifest. So if you take a tariff, for example, like in the case of the United States right now, although there's sort of always been tariffs in place all around the world, tariffs prevent countries from doing what's in their own self-interest, which is either selling a good to another country or importing a good from another country because it's more efficient for them to specialize on one thing or another. If you think about regulation, regulation prevents companies from acting with maximum efficiency and doing what they want in markets, which is to meet the needs of consumers. Price caps or subsidies, in the same way, impact and manipulate the way that the market would naturally meet the needs of consumers and suppliers. If you look back at this curve, if you price the cap at any one point, then demand stops meeting supply, and you get disequilibrium in the market, which is where you capped it at a certain price. Suppliers might not necessarily be willing to produce as much of it as is demanded at that price. So if we cap the price of butter at 50 cents a stick of butter, people are going to want to buy a lot of butter and not buy any cooking oil instead, but that doesn't mean the same amount of butter is going to get supplied to meet that increased demand, as a bit of a crude example. A bit of development on this. I'm not going to go very much into neoclassical economics. Is neoclassical economics. If you ask me what the difference is between classical economics and neoclassical economics, I don't actually know very much about what it is. But they had a bunch of maths and stuff. The key takeaway is, whereas classical economics thinks of pricing as being primarily a result of the cost of producing goods and services, neoclassical economics suggests that the perceived value of that good is the primary determinant of its cost. And it introduces the idea of diminishing marginal utility, which is that each additional unit produces less and less utility than the last. You can illustrate it crudely again. If you take a box of pizza, the first pizza slice that you eat is awesome. The last pizza slice that you eat is a bit shit. You might even pay someone else to take away that pizza slice because you hate the idea of eating it so much. That's essentially how neoclassical economics determines pricing, which is pricing increases until the marginal utility is zero. So the value utility to you of consuming one more unit of that good is now zero. That's when you cease to consume that product. Right. So that's the first bit of this seminar, and the key takeaway that I want you to do from that is this principle, right? Which is you have these inbuilt market mechanisms where people, if given the freedom to, will meet the needs of each other. They'll purchase goods from people that want to produce it, and people will produce goods that people need. And those needs are real. It's not just about, the greed for profits. It's people's need for food, it's people's need for technology, it's people's need for housing, and people's ability to produce those goods, right? So this school of economics can be thought of as cruel if you believe in certain criticisms of it, but you shouldn't throw it away because it thinks of things mathematically. It's still about allowing people to service the needs, fundamental needs of each other. The big criticism of that, though, that I'll get into in this seminar, is Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics develops out of the Great Depression, where classical economics and neoclassical economics couldn't really explain why such a massive recession was occurring. Essentially, the key claim that I've written here is inadequate overall demand can lead to prolonged periods of high unemployment, i.e., during a recession, people can be so pessimistic about the market and about the economy that rather than correcting for price issues, things get worse. So let's think about the dispute here. What should happen during an economic crisis when prices of everything goes down and wages of things go down under a classical economic theory? The basic principle here would be that because wages have gone down and the price of goods has plummeted because you're in the middle of a recession, the supply of that should pick back up, and businesses should be willing to reinvest into wages and into producing goods because it's cheap to do so. What happened during the Great Depression is that didn't occur. The reality was, because people's long-term thinking about the market was pessimistic, businesses didn't reinvest. And you get a spiral of economic crises where, because there's an economic crisis, there is low spending, and because there's low spending, that crisis gets worse, right? So this is the first or the major criticism of a self-regulated autonomous market. Keynesian solution to this, or the Keynesian solution to this, is spending money, or that government intervention in the market can sometimes be good. If businesses won't invest, if consumers won't spend, then the government should step in. That looks like building infrastructure, hiring workers, giving people cash stimuluses, cutting taxes, doing whatever it takes to get money flowing again. And that corrects for the problem of the pessimism that people have in the long-term opportunities that exist in a market. Key to this working is a concept called the multiplier effect, which, if you've heard of it, just means that each dollar of government spending has more than $1 worth of, creates more than $1 worth of economic activity. The reason for that is, when you spend money, it actually gets spent over and over and over again several times in the economy, right? If the government builds a bridge and it hires a construction worker, that construction worker gets $1. They spend that dollar on groceries, which gives the grocer some money. They might put that in the bank will lend it out to someone else, they'll spend that money again, and money gets used over and over again. So through government stimuluses, you're able to have an excised impact on the amount of economic activity that's occurring and correct for the major boom and bust cycles that happen in unregulated or self-regulated capitalist markets. The question that you might have here then is, what about inflation, right? Inflation is a really big deal at the moment because we've come out of a recession in which we did a lot of spending, or not a recession, but for every country, out of an economic crisis caused by COVID, where a lot of spending was done, and now we're dealing with the consequence of that. So what is inflation? How is it related to spending? Inflation is just when things get more expensive. So, I mean, you can think of it in different ways about the value of money and how much your dollar is worth, but the simplest part of it is just that inflation is when things are more expensive. You measure inflation using the consumer price index, which is just a measure of how much goods cost. And as goods get more expensive, inflation is going up. If goods are getting less expensive, inflation is going down. There are a few common mistakes that I want to try and teach you about inflation that are related to the previous two things that I've taught you about markets and supply and demand, and then government spending within markets. The first thing is that not all spending is inflationary. So previously, or I guess I didn't say previously, but inflation occurs when you have a lot of money in the economy chasing around too few goods. It's a bit crude, and there are more nuanced definitions of inflation, but that's what causes it. So spending will cause inflation when there's an increase in money without a commensurate increase in productivity. How does that relate to the previous things I've said? If we go back here and we look at supply and demand, imagine the government suddenly pumps billions of dollars into the economy, but doesn't have any change in the amount of supply of goods and services that exist. So that money doesn't cause any increase in productivity, all it does is give people more money. That boosts the demand curve, but it doesn't change the location of the supply curve, and prices go up. So that's the relationship between government spending and inflation. But the caveat there is, it's dependent on the change in productivity. So not all spending will cause inflation. Spending doesn't cause inflation when there's a commensurate increase in productivity, which you could predict based on things like, is there untapped productivity left in the economy? For example, are there large amounts of unemployment that mean the workforce isn't operating at maximum productivity, which you can unlock through government spending which gives people jobs? Or for example, are there other issues in supply? Is there poor infrastructure? And will infrastructure spending allow productivity in the economy to be unlocked by helping businesses operate efficiently, create new markets, create new enterprises, right? So understanding things like inflation goes back to all these different theories that I've been talking about. And that's what I'm trying to convey by teaching you those things. Some spending might even reduce inflation. So for example, if you look at Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, it's a reduction act, but it spends a shitload of money. And the reason why it's able to spend a shitload of money whilst targeting reducing inflation is because the spending is focused on fixing actual root problems in the economy, which is what's causing the inflation to happen, how do we fix those different pressures that will mitigate all this excess money chasing around too few goods. Additionally, it's important to remember that not all inflation is bad. In a crisis, you might want some inflation because when there's high levels of inflation, that means in the future, your money will be worth less. And so you want to spend it now, which fixes problems like major demand slumps. Another example of where inflation might be okay or where you might be willing to trade it off against other things, inflation reduces the real value of debt, which just means if you think of debt, it's mostly fixed nominally, which means if I borrow $10,000 and I have $10,000 in debt, it doesn't go up when inflation goes up. I'm still $10,000 in debt. But $10,000 is less money after inflation because the value of money has decreased, which means inflation can be not so bad for some people. All right. The next thing that I want to go over is supply side economics. So this comes after Keynesian economics, first really popularized during the Reagan administration, and it came out of a period of stagflation, which is where you had high levels of inflation, but you still had, or you have a big recession happening, but you still have high levels of inflation. And Keynesian economics couldn't really describe that. The key claim of supply side economics is increasing the supply of goods and services is the engine of economic growth. Low taxes are good because when the wealthy have money, they invest it productively, and the government can get more revenue whilst collecting less money. This curve here, and the guy sitting in front of it, I can't remember his name, I think it's like Lefort or something, I don't know, is the amount of tax you have and the amount of government revenue you get from it, right? And the idea is, if you have government taxes that are too high, you suppress the amount of economic output that occurs, and the government actually gets less money overall. And so through tax cuts, you can boost efficiency and boost financial activity enough so the government actually makes more money whilst taking less money out of people's pockets. It also argues for other conservative principles like less regulation, because regulation slows down business growth. And the whole goal of this is just to boost supply as much as possible to drive economic growth. Did it work? Maybe, not really, maybe. Reagan's supply-side economic policies did lead to a big economic boom. However, his claim that his 1981 tax cuts would pay for themselves didn't happen. In 1982, they had to do tax cuts that were tax hikes that were the biggest in American history. The question, though, about whether you want to deal with the supply side or the demand side is still really important, no matter what you think about trickle-down economics and whether it works, or Reaganomics, or other conservative principles. Taxes, or reducing taxes, can be good. Governments are not always efficient spenders. You need to ask yourself whether the kind of spending that the alternative proposes spending money on is something that governments have information about. And low taxes can help make investment cheaper, which makes investors happy and gets money flowing around the economy again. However, there are also big issues with taxes. For example, tax cuts are often regressive, and the poorest often have the highest propensity to spend. So what that's saying is, when you cut taxes, because they're taxing people progressively, you reduce taxes, it tends to benefit wealthy people the most. So it's essentially a form of economic stimulus targeted towards middle class or upper middle class people. And those people, when they receive money, put a lot of it into savings. Compare that to people who are low income. When they receive money, they spend it because they have immediate needs that need to be serviced. So taxes, because they're regressive, are often not the most efficient way to get money flowing around the economy. And one common mistake that people make is forgetting that tax cuts are a form of government spending. They're reducing government revenue and putting money back into the hands of people. So you should think of it the same way that you think about welfare and consider who that welfare is going to when you support tax cuts. Another problem with tax cuts is they can be a big constraint on future government spending because they're very sticky compared to government spending. It's relatively easy to convince people to stop spending something, and usually spending isn't over a prolonged period of time. You spend money and then it's spent. Tax cuts, once they're in place, can be very difficult to reverse because it becomes very unpopular to raise taxes, which can mean choosing to do tax cuts now is a large long-term commitment to keeping taxes low, which you should do then in order to resolve economic crises and fix economic problems depends on a big range of factors. One thing you should ask yourself is, why is the economy failing? If there's a lack of faith in the economy, maybe spending is good, because spending will increase people's faith in long-term economic growth. But if the problem is a lack of faith in government, then spending might be bad, because spending by a corrupt government convinces market actors that the government is picking winners, and they'll never be able to meritocratically succeed in that market because the government is going to pick someone else who has closer relationships with them, who has better access to those channels of corruption. So in those contexts, for example, it might be more useful to consider tax cuts as the better form of stimulus, rather than the government choosing who that money should be directed towards. Another question is the longevity of that problem. If it's a short-term slump, a tax cut, which I said before is very sticky, might be overkill or a bad solution. Additionally, you need to think about whether the problem is sector-specific or economy-wide. If you have an economy-wide problem, a tax cut could be a great idea because it affects the economy relatively equally by giving all businesses a little bit more money to operate with. But if it's a sector-specific problem, then giving an economy-wide tax cut could be a bad idea because you can have adverse effects in other sectors that are doing fine. And spending, which you can target at specific areas of the economy, might be better. Okay, the final bit of economic theory that I want to go over is development economics. So this is a newer form or school of economics that considers the question, how do we help countries develop? A big part of it is the idea of the poverty trap, which is that poverty is a sort of self-fulfilling cycle that traps countries as being low income. So if you look at the cycle here on the screen, if you have low economic growth, you get low income, which produces low levels of education and healthcare, low levels of human capital, low productivity, and low income, which repeats the cycle of low saving, low investment, and low economic growth. And that's incredibly hard to escape, because if a country is poor, it can't fix the problems of poverty, which means it can't escape that poverty. It's still poor, so it starts again and it can't fix those problems. The idea here is that targeted intervention in economies can help to resolve these problems. So a few examples here. If you look at microfinance in Bangladesh, microfinance is more common now, but it was sort of first pioneered by giving small loans to entrepreneurs in Bangladesh who never would have qualified for traditional forms of finance. And because they're able to access that capital, they can invest in businesses which can create growth, which they never would have previously been able to do. Another example is, these balls are familiar, which was this additional cash transfer program in Brazil. It essentially paid families for keeping kids in school. And that meant that more kids got educated, which is an investment in human capital, which increases productivity and increases economic growth, and helped Brazil become a middle-income country rather than a low-income country. The idea here is that capital is not the only problem that poor countries face. So just putting money into the economy won't necessarily fix things, because there are underlying social problems which contribute to the poverty trap. Nations need things like education, healthcare, good governance, and strong institutions in order to resolve their problems. A good illustration of how you can use this in debates is if you think about, what's the best solution to fixing economic crises. Your immediate thought will probably be money, but often you need to address underlying root causes of those crises. So things like corruption, anti-corruption is one of the best economic policies that a country can implement. Having strong institutions like courts can help reassure people in the market that their contracts will be upheld and make foreign investors willing to invest in that economy. So there isn't easy solutions to all of these problems, but I think that is a useful way of thinking about economic problems in developing countries. All right. The final section of this seminar is I'm going to go over some common mistakes that people make in economics debates, and I'm going to try link them back to some of the principles and ideas that we previously talked about. Okay. The first big mistake, and I guess this is also a tip for doing economic debates, that I think people make is not asking themselves where a problem comes from. So when you think of an economic issue, that economic issue is almost always rooted in a tangible problem that's facing a country or facing a society. Those problems can be on the demand side, so you think of income inequality, unemployment, or a confidence crisis, can all be sources of low aggregate demand producing low growth and producing a recession. Does anyone know why income inequality is a demand side problem? No? Income inequality is bad for several reasons, one of which is it's unfair. We should probably strive towards a country that's more equal. But also, where economic policies produce income inequality, they can also produce large amounts of inefficiency. Because if wealth is concentrated in the wealthiest group of people, that's also the group of people with the lowest propensity to spend. So if poor people have no money, that produces demand-side problems around the total amount of output. Unemployment, confidence crisis are more simple. You can also have supply-side problems. That looks like things like resource scarcity, supply chain disruptions, having low productivity, skills shortages, corporate taxes and regulations can all restrict the amount of stuff that is supplied in the economy. The important takeaway is that you can't fix a demand-side problem with a supply-side solution and vice versa. And equally, you can't fix a supply-side problem with the wrong kind of supply-side solution. So for example, if you look at a problem like COVID, where you have massive supply chain disruptions, you can't really fix that problem by lowering corporate taxes and lowering regulations, because it doesn't resolve the underlying issue, which is companies can't import things properly, and their networks they've built up to manufacture things have broken down, right? So when you think of a debate, you need to get back to what the root cause of the economic problem you're describing is, and your solution needs to be connected directly to where that problem is located. Another example here is with inflation. Someone says the best solution to rising inflation is the government spending less money. That depends on what the source of the inflation is. And there's lots of different sources or places that inflation can come from. You can have cost push inflation, which is where rising costs of production force suppliers to push up prices. You can have demand pull inflation, which is where demand outpaces supply, pulling up prices as people want more stuff. You can have imported inflation, where rising costs of imported goods causes domestic inflation. You can have monetary inflation, where the central bank lets too much money into the economy. Solving inflation is not as simple as you need to reduce the amount of spending, or you need to increase the amount of supply. You need to think about where do you want inflation to be, and where inflation should be, and what's made inflation step out of line with that. And that's how you explain or prove how you actually fix those problems. The second issue that I think people often have in economics debates is forgetting that costs matter, even though businesses are rich and greedy. So when you think of things that inhibit the economy from, or businesses from functioning, or slow them down, like regulations and taxes, the argument in favor of them is often that businesses are really rich and they're extremely greedy, so we should be comfortable taking away some of those profits through taxes or through regulations. But it's precisely because companies are greedy that might be unwise. Companies pass costs on to consumers in the form of higher prices, which doesn't mean regulations are always bad, but it means you need to ask yourself whether those higher prices are worth the regulatory benefit that you're getting. So an example of this is European consumer law. Very high regulation, higher prices. You need to ask yourself whether that's worth it, and whether the regulatory benefit is something that the average consumer, or especially vulnerable consumers, would be willing to trade off. So who's that regulation benefiting? Why is it actually worth implementing? Finally, is not being precise about market failures. So regulations and taxes, as mentioned, have real pros and cons. If you're going to implement them and you're going to make an argument, which is the increase in price and the added friction to doing business is worth it because of some benefit we're getting from the regulation, you need to be specific about the market failure that you're correcting and why that problem exists. So you can talk about externalities, which is where the consequences of business doing things don't inhibit the business itself, but do hurt other people. So for example, pollution doesn't hurt my manufacturing plant, but it does hurt people who drink water nearby. That could be a market failure where the market isn't adequately correcting for that consequence, and we need to correct it. Monopolies, where one actor controls the market and is able to set prices above what's in the interest of consumers. Imperfect information, where market actors who these economic theories back here assume are rational don't have adequate information in order to know what something should be priced, whether they're being ripped off, how the market should operate, or even businesses who might profit from entering into a market and competing with another firm can't do that because they don't have adequate information to enter that market. If you look at the example of international competition in particular, complex regulations and high levels of corruption can cause businesses not to have adequate information to enter into that market and compete properly. Behavioral economics, which is the study of biases that make consumers imperfectly irrational. All right, that's the main things that I've got for you in this seminar. The big thing that I want you to take away is there are really two ways, not two ways, but thinking about these two theories of economics and the interaction between the two, and one is appropriate, is going to be really useful for you understanding the case. But what you need to ask yourself is, what's the justification behind the argument I'm making, and what specific problems does it target in the economy? I think this is probably the best tip in the whole seminar, which is ask yourself where a problem comes from, and then how your economic solution targets that problem. Whether it's a market failure, whether it's a natural occurrence like a war, or whether it's inefficiency in the market itself, ask yourself where that comes from, and then try and reason from these economic principles how your solution rectifies that and what the outcomes are. All right, any questions? Yeah.
Is it okay if you share the presentation with us?
Yeah. All right. I've asked Matt to come up with the topics today.
There's 7 in your DMs right now.
I'll give the internal officers a moment to start setting up the draw, and then we'll do that debate.
If you haven't filled out the sign-up form today, can you please fill it out? No.